Well, why don't we start and then people can join us as they can. So welcome everyone and thanks for joining us today. For those of you who are new to Cooper, our mission is to support parents through providing information on research and parenting and child development through multiple forums, like today's assembly, through live workshops, recorded workshops, and through parenting groups that meet once a month virtually that are led by an expert in parenting and child development. And our groups cover everything from potty training to tantrums and sleep. So important topics to everyone in the family. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Erin O'Connor. I am the Chief of Education here at Cooper. I'm a developmental psychologist and also a professor and head of the early childhood program at NYU. And I'm thrilled today to be speaking with Jeanne Donaldson, who we've had the opportunity to talk a bunch of times, I guess, before at this point, around many things, but in particular timeouts. Jeanne earned her PhD in psychology from the University of Florida and completed a postdoctoral fellowship at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and the Kennedy Krieger Institute. She was previously an assistant professor in education and psychology and leadership at Texas Tech and is currently a professor in the Department of Psychology at Louisiana State University. Her research focuses on solving problems common in early childhood and assessing child and adult preference for interventions. She is currently also an associate editor at the Journal of Applied Behavioral Analysis. Dr. Donaldson is a BCBAD and licensed behavior analyst in the state of Louisiana. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, we have, I think, a lot of topics and questions that we want to cover, but primarily around timeouts, given all the research on timeouts, as well as the sort of chatter, I would say, and more sort of popular social media venues around timeouts and how often those two don't necessarily say the same things. So, I think timeouts is such a great example, at least to me, of where research can be really rigorous and done really well. And then sometimes when it gets out of the research journals, not always presented in as accurate a way as possible.
For sure.
By just telling us a little bit about what a timeout is when done sort of in the way that we research a timeout.
Sure. So I think I'll start by reminding or maybe telling everyone for the first time that the word timeout as an intervention is really the shorthand for the term, because the procedure is really a timeout from positive reinforcement. And so what that involves is that you start with a context where there are lots of fun things, lots of things that might be reinforcers or rewarding for your child. So for example, in your home, your child might have access to toys or your attention or siblings. At school, this might be running around on the playground at recess. So that time in period, so before we're implementing our timeout, there have to be reinforcers available. There have to be fun things that your child likes available in the environment. And then timeout is when we remove the child's access to those things for some period of time. And what the research shows is that this period of time can be very short. So 1 minute might be too short for most kids, but 2 or 3 minutes is probably plenty. 4 minutes, definitely plenty for the vast majority of children. So it's a brief period of time where then they don't have any access to all that fun stuff that they had access to before. And then after that time, they go back to that fun environment and get access again to all of those fun things.
I like how you talk about access to a fun environment, because I think sometimes, at least how I've seen it taken out of context, is it's like isolation, right? Like complete isolation from the caregiver, from their friends, from everything, going into another room. And I like what you're saying. It's not isolating them from everyone in social interaction. It's just taking away their access to some fun activity that they're engaged in at the time.
Yeah, and I want to mention too, my preferred approach to timeout is to not remove the child entirely from the environment where they were. So not an isolation timeout or a timeout where they are sent to a separate space where you can no longer see them and they can no longer see you. So timeout can be really effective if it's what we call a sit and watch. So basically your child has to sit on the sideline. So they can't play with any of those toys. They don't get your attention for this period of time. But they can still see all the fun that was going on, and you can still supervise and monitor what they're doing during timeout. So yeah, I would be very cautious about ever implementing something like an isolation timeout. We just don't need to do that. And it introduces all kinds of risks if you can't be supervising the child. And I saw a question pop up. So can I go ahead and answer that?
Please do.
Okay, so I think Ariel asked, if the time is the same, duration is the same for all ages. There's a bit of, there's a rule of thumb you'll hear about 1 minute per year of age, which I think there's no real research to support that specific guideline, but in general, it's a decent guideline. So if you're starting to use timeout with really young kids, so 1 year, 18 months or so, then 1 minute is probably plenty. But once you hit the 4-minute mark, your 5 or 6-year-old doesn't need to spend more than 4 minutes in timeout. So I would use 4 minutes as your maximum, and really 1 or 2 minutes as the minimum. We find in some of the research studies that 1 minute is not enough to be effective, but it probably is if you're working with really little kids.
Thank you. I think that's such an important clarification, because I think we hear that a lot, at least, on Instagram or whatever. So, if you have a 7 or 8-year-old, you're looking at 8-9 minutes, which just is not what the research tells us, right? So, sort of thinking about the different ways to do a timeout. If you had a toddler, let's say, who was playing with a sibling and, scratched them or engaged in some maybe behavior that wasn't so safe for both of them, or at least for one of them, how would you recommend actually implementing the timeout? So, what would that look like?
Okay, so before I would get there, so timeout isn't a procedure that I would all of a sudden decide, okay, right now in the moment, we are going to try this for the first time because I saw you do something I really don't like and I want to get rid of it. And here we go. So before you get to the point where you're using timeout, I would explain the process to your child. And first and foremost, timeout, as I mentioned, needs to be, I would focus less on what the specific behaviors are and more about when is it a good time to use timeout. So some people get kind of caught up in saying, okay, for any sort of sibling aggression, so if my child hits their sibling, then that equals timeout. But the problem is, if we don't have that fun time in, then timeout might not work very well. It won't work very well. So it's more about when to use it. So if we're talking about a play context where they've got access, this is a fun time. And even during fun times, kids can sometimes engage in problematic behavior. Then now is a good time to use timeout. So first pick the times and then talk with your child about what it means. And tell them what you would do. So if you do anything that is unsafe or unkind, and then you're going to spell out what those things are, then I'm going to ask you to go to timeout and what that means, and then show them where timeout is. Have a little role playing, but keep it light because they're not actually being sent to timeout. Ask them to show you what it looks like to sit nicely in timeout. And then deliver praise for doing that. Yes, that's exactly how you would sit nicely. And then, show them where the timer is. I'm going to set a timer. And when the timer beeps, or if you've got a sand timer, when the sand runs out, then you're free to leave timeout and go back to playing. And as long as you're playing nicely, you get to stay and have fun. But if I see you do anything unsafe or unkind, then I'm going to ask you to go to timeout. So then when that moment comes, and sibling scratches the other sibling, then as calmly as you possibly can say, you may not scratch your sibling, that is unkind, or whatever words you've already used to explain the rules. You need to go sit in timeout. And then what happens next depends. So some kids, okay, I gotta go, and they'll sit. And you start the timer and all is, they're glum, but it's going fine. And then timer ends and they head back. More commonly, your child will refuse to go, or upon arriving, attempt to escape, or be very upset, and might engage in some problematic behavior during timeout because they've just lost access to all of these wonderful, fun things. And this is very upsetting for them. So then it's your job as the parent to safely and calmly as you can, manage that timeout situation. So what I mean by that is if they can escape from timeout. So if you tell them to go and they don't go, or they don't stay, then you haven't effectively removed access to all of the reinforcers. So if you feel like, and I want to be really clear about this, if you feel like you can't safely get your child to go or safely keep them in the designated timeout space, then don't use timeout. It's not, there are many ways to change behavior. So then you might decide timeout's not for me. It makes me too upset to see my kid get this upset. I don't like having to keep bringing them back to the timeout area. And we can talk about some ways to increase the likelihood that they'll stay and sit calmly. But if you find yourself getting very upset about their behavior during timeout, then I would recommend putting it on pause and trying to figure out a different way to manage the behavior.
Thank you. I like that recommendation because I do find that sometimes it's really hard, right? And if you're thinking about sort of co-regulation and supporting your child in their regulation, if you're feeling like you can't regulate in the moment, then maybe it's not for you, right? It's not for everybody.
Yeah. And then the other important part is sometimes when your child does something that you've decided, this is a timeout worthy behavior and it's the right time to do timeout because they're having a good time otherwise or have access to this really fun environment. Sometimes their behavior can be really upsetting to you. Mm-hmm. And so the last bit, when they do sit in timeout and their time is up, then it's really important, as best you can, to not hold a grudge or not let them know you're holding a grudge. They've essentially served their time. They get access to the fun environment and they should get access to fun you as much as they had before the incident happened.
I like that point because I think sometimes we're tempted to kind of discuss it more, right? And somehow think, I'm going to provide this learning environment, but maybe that's not really what your child needs in that moment. So I'm curious, you're talking about, I love how, you're setting up with your child what to expect in a timeout before all of a sudden, boom, this is implemented right in the moment. So with very young children who might not be at that point where they can sort of, understand the meaning behind it, do you recommend a timeout, or do you think that maybe a timeout should be reserved until a child gets a little bit older?
That's a great question. So you can use timeouts with pretty young kids. They don't have to understand all of the instructions ahead of time. I would still give them the instructions ahead of time, because sometimes our kids are capable of understanding a whole lot more than we think they are, or they're capable of understanding a lot more than they can express. But at least pairing that word timeout with the area and showing them, when you're in this area, here's how you sit. And then they'll figure it out through the process, because what they'll do is they will try to leave the area because timeout is no fun, right? That's the whole point of it. It's designed to, you were having so much fun and then you did something that was unsafe or unkind. And so you can't be in this fun environment for a little bit. And so now we've removed all the fun. And if they're very young, they won't understand, why am I stuck here? And I see all those toys over there. So they will try to go back. But you can just gently block them and redirect them back to timeout without saying anything, until the timer beeps. And then when the timer beeps, you let them know, all right, go have fun again. And as you were saying, Erin, I think we are tempted to then use that after timeout moment to try to explain all the things. And that's not our best time to do so. So we should, not that we shouldn't explain all the things to our kids or have a conversation about it, but now is the time that they get to go back and have fun. And later we can talk about why things happened or why we have certain rules, or how we're going to make better choices next time.
So I like this, idea of pairing a consequence to behavior. And then maybe following up with a bit of a conversation around why that consequence is related to that behavior. How do you recommend kind of doing that effectively, right? So with a young child where, they might have forgotten, let's say that, they scratched their sibling while they're playing, and then, at dinner time, you bring it up. Like, is it worth doing that at that point, do you think, or just, kind of let it go?
Yeah, if they're really young, I'd let it go, especially because if you bring up the scratch, then they're probably not going to know what you're talking about, but the other sibling will, and it might make them upset again, remembering that they got scratched. It might make them angry at their sibling, even though their sibling has moved on entirely and doesn't know what you're talking about. So I think those, conversations for later are for slightly older kids who might be asking questions or might want to have a discussion about why they went to timeout or things like that, or what the rules are. But again, I would reiterate at the start of a new playtime or the start of a new activity, when you think this is going to be an appropriate time to use timeout to promote safe play, then I'd mention what the rules are and show some examples of how to play nicely with whatever the toys are that you've got out that day. So then they can see, here's how I'm supposed to play. And when you see them playing that way, then delivering praise, and it's extra fun when you're staying safe. And then any, rule infraction that would be unsafe or unkind, then using timeout.
I like that point about showing them what is safe and appropriate, because I feel like so often we have expectations for our children's behavior, right? But maybe they don't know what those expectations are. So if they quote unquote violate them, it's confusing, right? Because they're like, well, I didn't know I wasn't supposed to do this, or I didn't know I was supposed to do this. And just that constant conversation and being very explicit with them is so important, with timeouts and with everything, but especially when you're thinking about a timeout.
Yeah, we really want to set them up for success, right? I mean, the goal is to have your child playing in a safe and kind and creative way. And so we want to make sure that they are supported in doing that. And it's just in these moments where things get out of control, or, something happens that, okay, we need to pull you away for a couple minutes. But otherwise, that's the other thing about timeout is, when done properly, it is so effective that your child should have very little contact with timeout. So if you are using timeout and using timeout over and over and over, then something's gone wrong. And so it should be something that happens occasionally during playtimes, but is not like every single day during this playtime, we have to use timeout 5 times. Then something's not going right.
So, like what you're saying, they're very effective when used appropriately and don't need to be used that often. Can you talk a little bit about, I find the research on timeouts to be very compelling because, a lot of them are based in really rigorous research design. Can you talk a little bit about what the research is telling us around timeouts and, what we can take away from that as a parent?
Yeah. So there is a whole lot of, as Erin mentioned, really rigorous studies looking at timeout, both timeout individually and timeout as a component of larger parent training packages. And consistently in the literature, it's found that timeout, when used appropriately, so when it's done in the context of this is a really fun environment and timeout means stepping away from that fun environment for a period, then we find immediate effects on behavior and drastic reductions in dangerous or unsafe or problematic behavior.
So when you say drastic reductions, like, can you give an example sort of for folks to put it in context if you have, let's say, a toddler or a young child?
Yeah, so I think I've conducted some timeout research on the playground, and I had kids that in baseline, so before we implement timeout, it's just them at recess and we're recording their unsafe behavior on the playground. They might engage in 5 to 10 unsafe behaviors per minute on the playground. And this is why they get referred to us. And then, so that's a lot. Not every kid does that. But so these are, the kids who are really struggling to play safely on the playground. And then we implement timeout. And in that first session, they might engage in one instance of unsafe behavior, go to timeout, and then none for the rest of recess. And over time, we see that for the most part, they don't go to timeout at all at recess anymore because they're playing safely the entire time. But occasionally they go to timeout once or twice per recess period. So we're looking at, this change from a child who was a near constant danger to themselves and to other kids on the playground. So behavior like pushing other kids down the slide, throwing sand, climbing on top of the high playground equipment, things that, and unfortunately, playgrounds are wonderful and kids should have so much time outside to free play, but lots of injuries happen on playgrounds when equipment is misused, especially when we have whole classes of students on the playground. And so then we go from those kinds of unsafe behaviors happening very regularly to none or almost no unsafe behavior.
When you see a timeout in any context, but just thinking about the research that you're talking about right now, that timeout involves time with the teacher though, right? So it's removing them, but it's removing them from the fun environment of the play space or whatever, but it's not removing them from, because like what we talked about earlier, I think why timeouts are sometimes really scary for folks is they envision this child off in the corner with nobody attending to them, So can you talk a little bit about what that timeout looks like?
Yeah, so it looks like once the teacher notices that an unsafe behavior has occurred, then the teacher tells that child, oh, you may not jump off the swing. You need to go sit in timeout. And then the child goes and sits either on a bench or sits alongside the playground in a designated spot and waits until the timer beeps. Now, again, sometimes this requires a little management of making sure the child doesn't leave that area. So the teacher might have to, if the child tries to leave, then block the child and say, send them back to timeout. But then timer beeps and they run right back with all their friends on the playground. So the teacher attention is present in some ways to make sure that the child doesn't have access to all the fun things at recess that they do during time in. But teacher attention during recess is kind of always available. So if the child was interested in interacting with the teacher, at any time they could come and chat with the teacher or make appropriate requests, and those would be honored. So they might get some minimal amount of attention in timeout just to ensure the timeout occurs. But it's otherwise still less attention than they have, and overall way less fun than playing on the playground
with their friends on the playground. Yeah. So if you don't, sorry, I'm just reading a question from the chat. If you don't use timeout at home, but they use it at school, how do you talk to your child about that? Or do you need to practice it at home? That's a good question.
Yeah, so it's really up to you. So you don't have to have, it's helpful for kids if the home system for managing behavior is consistent with the school system, because then that just makes the kid's life easier in the sense of I don't have to figure out how to follow the rules. The rules are consistent and so are the consequences. But if everything is going fine at home and you don't see a need to add timeout as something that you want to do in your home, then you don't have to, even if they do that at school. And there might be circumstances at school that, like on the playground. So when I take my kids to the park, I let them do all kinds of stuff on the equipment because I'm right there. I've got two kids, but if we all go as a family, it's 1-to-1 or 1-to-2. So even if my kid gets them, is walking up the slide, I can keep an eye out and make, and there are only a handful of other kids on the playground. But in a preschool or kindergarten classroom where you might have 20 to 40 kids on that same kind of playground equipment, now going up the slide is much more dangerous because kids might be coming down at any time. And your teacher to kid ratio is way different. So the rules have to be a little bit stricter at school to keep everyone safe. So sometimes there are those discrepancies in what you do at home and what happens at school. And that's totally okay. If school is reporting that your child is struggling with the timeout procedure, then it might be helpful to role play and incorporate that at home as you see appropriate. But if it's otherwise not a problem, then I think it's okay for there to be some differences in how behavior is managed at school versus at home.
I like that point because we so often hear about the importance of consistency, which it is important, right, between home and school, but it doesn't have to be fully consistent, right, if the environment doesn't warrant it. So I'm just curious, you're talking a lot about unsafe behaviors with timeouts. Would you say there's sort of a general rule about when a timeout is appropriate for a behavior versus maybe a behavior that wouldn't warrant a timeout when we're thinking about, encouraging children to be safe and supportive and kind?
Yeah, I mean, I think that ends up being a personal judgment call on what's important to you. I think keeping in mind, the goal, even when we're talking about these times where I've said it's appropriate to use timeout at the playground, at recess, during free play at home. So these times where there are so many fun things happening. So having to leave that fun thing will effectively reduce the behavior that has gotten them removed from this environment. But we want kids to spend as much time as possible in those environments. Kids tend to not spend enough time getting to play freely. Even at my preschooler gets homework. What is this? So and my, when my daughter, who's now in second grade, was in kindergarten in Louisiana, the public schools give 15 minutes of recess. And that's it all day. So I do not want kids pulled out of these fun, free times on a regular basis, or for things that are really kind of more minor infractions that we might solve in other ways. So in that sense, I think, and the other thing is timeout is not fun to implement. So when you are the parent and you've created the rules that if you do this when you're playing with your sibling, you're going to have to go to timeout, then consistency is key. So if you've said that that's timeout worthy in this context, then you've got to follow through with it. And so I would limit pretty strategically what you're going to use timeout for, so that you're not on the hook for like, oh, do I have to do timeout for that? Because it won't, the process isn't fun. And again, it's not designed to be. Your kid is having to sit out for a bit because they've done something that you really don't want to see again. So I would avoid doing it for things that just annoy you but aren't harmful.
Yeah, that's a good distinction. So I'm curious, you mentioned you're a mom of two, sort of how your research in this field has, informed how you parent, and sort of maybe the 3 or 4 most important things that you take away from this work when you're figuring out all this, how to implement it, when to implement it, all these things.
Yeah, I think so I was a timeout researcher before I was a parent. And I think being a parent has made me really appreciate how hard it is to implement these procedures, even though I had the luxury of having implemented these procedures with other people's kids, hundreds of times. So I knew the power of consistent, effective timeout. But then doing it with your own kids is different. And when it's your own kid that's upset, and I was never emotionally upset when I was working with other people's kids. It was like, I know the process. I know they're going to get upset. I also know they're going to be fine when they leave. And it's not that I didn't logically know that about my own kids too, but it just feels different. Yeah. So I can appreciate that anyone who has either tried to use timeout and thought, this isn't working, I can't do it, or thinks I don't want to do timeout. I don't blame you. It is not fun or easy, but when done well, it can make a big difference. And so I've used timeout with both of my kids, and initially they had some problematic behavior during timeout, but then they figure out that doesn't get them out of timeout. And now we use it very, very sparingly. I mean, I can't remember the last time either of my kids went to timeout, because it is one of those procedures that when you use it consistently and at the right times, then pretty much eliminates the problem. Oh,
So,
there was a
okay.
question about timeout in their room. Yeah. So uh, I I would recommend against timeout in the bedroom for a couple of reasons. One is that usually kids have a fair amount of toys and things in their bedrooms. So now we're essentially moving from one fun environment to a different fun environment, which is not really a timeout. So it's less likely to be effective. The other is that if you're not going to their room with them, then now, again, you're not able to supervise your child in timeout. So who knows what they're doing, which could either be engaging in more problematic behavior in their room because they're upset at being removed from the other environment, or playing and having a great time, which is not a timeout. And you mentioned the negative associations with the bedroom. Yeah, so there are some old studies that show timeout with infants who were crawling and pulling on electrical cords. And so what they did is anytime the child would touch a cord, they would pick them up and put them in their crib for 30 seconds as a timeout and then put them back down. So basically the child lost access to the freedom of crawling around the house. This worked really well, but I would also be concerned about crib timeouts because sleep, as you all know, as parents, sleep is so incredibly important. And you don't want the crib to be associated with a timeout procedure because the crib is happy, calm sleep, or might not be happy, but it's it's a place for sleep, not for punishment. So I think the same with the room. Like the room is a nice kind of calm chill out. And you might use that for times when, especially I think with my 7-year-old, there are some times where she gets upset about something. It's like, why don't you just go take a break in your room? But that's different than a timeout because she's not done something dangerous or tremendously unkind. And it's just, you might have a better time calming down in your room where you have access to audiobooks and your stuffed animals and whatever else. And I want to mention the stuffed animal in timeout. So lots of people are tempted to create a timeout space that is like, this is our calm down space. Timeout's not your calm down space. You can have a calm down space where you've got, a soft, comfy chair, some, calming items. People use those stress balls and all of those things. But those things should be, used for if you're looking upset or you look like you need a break, or whenever you feel like you want to go and just sit and calm, great. But those items tend to be kind of fun and relaxing. And timeout is you're taking a break from a really fun time, not because you're overstimulated, but because you've done something that we can't have you do again.
I like that distinction that you make. At least I've seen in classrooms. Sometimes I think it's not made as clearly for children of the calm down space versus a timeout. Like, can you talk a little bit more about, like you're saying, removing sort of the fun versus sort of calming down, but in like in practice, when, you're working with, especially I feel like if you have more than one child and there's a conflict between them, distinguishing that, okay, going to a place where you can help regulate versus, having a consequence for a behavior that's not safe.
Yeah. And I think it's nice to have strategies in place for calming down when you get upset, because those are nice, replacements. So instead of when you get so upset, you scratch your sister, then instead of that, when you notice yourself getting really upset, you might choose to go to the calm down space where there are things that you like and you can chill out. And I might even come over and have a lovely conversation with you because I'm so proud that you handled this really difficult situation by choosing to use the calm down space. But if we use that calm down space after something like you've scratched your sister, now go to the calm down space, we might start to see more scratching because the calm down space is kind of lovely. And if the way that I get access to that, or if the way that, especially if a parent then comes and is like, oh, I'm so glad you're calming down. So the way I get this special parent attention is first I scratch, then I calm down, and now I get this great attention. And kids pick up on that so easily that the technical term is we've taught a behavior chain. So first I have to do something that's unkind or unsafe. Then I show my calm down strategies. And then my parent is really proud of me for calming down. But we want to cut that out. You don't have to do the unkind or unsafe behavior to get to do the calm down and to get my special attention. In fact, when you do the unsafe or unkind thing, then you don't get my attention or the extra things in the calm down.
That makes sense. Such an important distinction, but I think sometimes hard to make in the moment as a parent, right?
It is, and it's hard for teachers too, because sometimes we wait too long. We let kids get too upset. And if they've gotten too upset to where they've done something that's unsafe or unkind, then we're kind of stuck. Like we've lost the moment to teach now those self-regulation skills, and we're going to try again next time before we get to that point. But yeah, I find that too. And teachers also, I think, are in this tricky spot of, if timeout is going to make kids upset, then they might not be able to do that easily in the classroom when they're monitoring the behavior of 20 plus students. So setting up a calm down space seems like an attractive option because it reduces what looks like those side effects of timeout. But really, it might accidentally be making that behavior more likely, because my teacher sends me to the calm down space and I get to get out of the work that I didn't want to do.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So thinking, sort of as we wrap up a little bit about, we sort of started talking about how timeouts are such a good example in a way of where research and, sort of social media attention don't always match, right? Like what's presented doesn't really bear out in the research. Can you, provide any sort of advice for parents when they're looking at timeout research, or actually research in general, and you kind of see something and you're like, okay, I was doing a timeout, now I feel like I shouldn't do a timeout, or, I wasn't, now I feel like I should, like how to sort of process that information and figure out whether it's for you or not and for your family?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. So um, I think, again, if you feel uneasy about timeout, there are lots of other strategies you can use. So it doesn't have to be part of your parenting strategy. And I think more broadly, but if you've heard me say today, it's tremendously effective and the research shows it's effective. So if you're kind of like, I have some concerns about my child's behavior that I think would really be helped by timeout, I think the most important piece is to think about your relationship with your child. So if you have put in the work to have a really strong and mostly positive relationship with your child, then these brief moments of timeout that are used very strategically, very sparingly, at very specific times are not going to harm that relationship. And in so many ways will help, because kids want clear boundaries. They need the safety of, my parent isn't going to let me keep doing dangerous things without doing something about it. And they test us all the time with this. And so, in that moment, timeout might not feel good because your kid was really upset and you were upset by their behavior, and then you were upset by their behavior in timeout. And this is emotionally hard. But then, once they're done with timeout and they go back to playing, and you can take a step back and think, okay, so today I had so many wonderful interactions with my child. I made sure that I commented on all the interesting things they were doing, or many of them. We had great time together. And then we had this one blip in the day where they did something really unsafe or unkind, and I implemented timeout. And then the rest of the day, I didn't see anything unsafe or unkind. So I think that will help you decide if it's for you or not. Now, if you're finding that adding timeout means you notice yourself looking for reasons to put them in timeout, and using timeout when you were upset and angry, even though this wasn't really the right time to use timeout, then you might step back and say, maybe this isn't right for me because I'm not able to stay calm and I'm not able to not hold a grudge after timeout. And it's damaging the relationship I have with my child.
Thank you so much. I feel like that is such a key principle to think about when we're consuming all of this stuff, especially timeouts, but is that relationship that we have with our child, and when it feels like it's working and when it feels like maybe it's not working, and we don't have to do it then, right? Because as somebody who studies attachment, I feel like that's often sort of the piece that's often put out there. It's going to harm the attachment relationship, but something like a timeout when used in an appropriate context is not, right? So what would you suggest if timeouts don't work for your family? We got a question.
Yeah. So then in part, it would depend. So I'd still, whether you use timeouts or not, have the general recommendation of make sure that every day, at least for a little bit of time, like 10 minutes, you're spending really high quality time with your child. And what I mean by that is high quality time from their perspective. So you're not asking them to do anything. And you're following their lead and taking an interest in what they've chosen to do, and just being present and part of that. And then, setting clear expectations throughout the day for what they should be doing during each different kind of activity, providing lots of praise and positive comments for when they are meeting those expectations and following the rules. So setting them up for success. And then you can expect that all kids engage in some problematic behavior. So you can also, people don't tend to like this, but a fair amount of it you can kind of let slide. Now, if it's dangerous to a sibling, you might need to intervene physically and separate them and, move on. But then you can think about, okay, what is causing the behavior problem? And that's going to be individual. You could tell me my two kids fight all the time, and I can't tell you exactly why unless I've spent some time with your specific kids figuring that out. Or you might say, I only have one kid, but he, sometimes bites other kids when we go to the playground or throws toys or whatever. But again, why your child does that might be different than why another child does that. So then it's about kind of figuring out, why are they doing that? And how can I rearrange their world so they don't get what they're getting from it? And I can making better choices or teaching them an alternative to get that same thing. So the answer to what to do instead tends to be a bit more complicated and tricky. But yeah, you don't have to do timeout. You can just kind of, let it go, handle it in the way that you want to. I would say though, one thing that's nice about timeout is once you have a good consistent strategy in place, then it's really clear to your kid what's going on. It gives everyone this kind of pause, because once your kid has practiced going to timeout and they sit there calmly, then everyone gets a little bit of a pause and a break, and then they go back and you can regroup. And I think that calmly implementing timeout is definitely an improvement over yelling at your kid. Not that I haven't yelled at my kids on occasion, but when I do, I'm usually like, man, I've lost that one. So there are alternative ways to react, but some of them are certainly worse for your relationship with your kid than timeout.
Good point. Thank you. So I know we're sort of running out of time here. I just want to see if anybody had any final questions. Okay, the strategies recommend for an upset child in timeout who may respond with unkind words. Should you just ignore their comments? Oh yeah, respond with something.
Oh, yes. And kids know just how to shove the sword through your heart and twist it when they're upset. So your kid probably knows all the special things to really hurt your feelings. And yeah, I think if you don't want to hear those words again, then don't say anything and don't act like it hurts you, even though of course it does, because that's essentially their attempt to get your attention. And now, don't you know how mad I am at you? And noted, you do, but better to leave it be. Now, at a later time, if your child's older and might be able to understand this conversation, you might have a conversation with them about, I love you very much, and I know that you love me, but when you tell me that you don't love me or you tell me that you hate me, it hurts my feelings. Because, part of your job as a parent too is to teach your child to have these kinds of adult conversations when someone does something hurtful to them. They don't have to just let it go and ignore it. They can have an adult conversation with someone to say, listen, I didn't like the way you treated me, and in the future, I hope you'll speak to me differently. So I think as part of the teaching them how to manage those sorts of interactions, that can be useful. But in the moment, they're just trying to get a rise out of you. And if they're successful, then you're going to hear that they hate you or don't love you all the more often, which is not the goal.
That is so hard when you hear
Yeah.
that. And to even your nonverbal reactions, right? When you hear your child say, I hate you, it's so challenging. Well, Jeannie, this was delightful as always. Thank you so much. Is it okay if we give your email out for folks if they want to reach you and have questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, do you want to tell us the various ways that we might be able to reach you?
Yes, and I'll put my email in the chat. So it's jdonaldson@lsu.edu. And so I'm kind of a compulsive email checker. So I will certainly get back to you, especially if in the subject line you mention the Cooper parenting.
Thank you. And yes, you are amazing with email, I have to say. I always know if I email, you'll be right back. Well, thank you, everyone. It was wonderful to see you all. And hopefully we'll see you in a Cooper group sometime soon as well.
Yeah, thanks for the great questions.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.